Everyone thought the biggest story of the Chinese Grand Prix would be the championship fight. They were wrong. Because just days after the season began in Australia, something explosive started happening behind the scenes in Formula One. Ferrari built a rear wing so extreme, it literally flips its aerodynamic profile while the car is driving down the straight. A design capable of adding up to 10 km per hour of extra top speed. In modern Formula One, that kind of gain is enormous. But here is the part almost nobody saw coming. The moment rival teams realized what Ferrari was about to bring to China, the mood inside the paddock changed instantly. Engineers started questioning the legality. Teams began calling the FIA. And according to multiple paddock sources, Mercedes is now leading a growing revolt against Ferrari's SF-26 Macarena rear wing. Because if this device works the way simulations suggest, Ferrari might have just found the most powerful aerodynamic weapon of the new regulation era. And what happened before the Chinese Grand Prix could completely reshape the championship battle. But to understand why teams are suddenly panicking, we need to go back to one moment in Australia that most fans completely missed. Because that single moment explains everything. Australia looked like a normal season opener. Crowds, pressure, new cars finally racing for the first time. But inside the garages, teams were not only watching the race. They were watching the data. Every straight, every deployment phase, every tiny change in speed. Because the 2026 regulations created a completely different Formula One environment. Less drag, more electrical power, more dependence on aerodynamic efficiency. And that means something very important. Small differences suddenly become massive advantages. During the race in Melbourne, Ferrari looked strong. The SF-26 had excellent traction. The car rotated well in medium-speed corners. And during the opening laps, both drivers looked extremely comfortable. Charles Leclerc pushed hard. Lewis Hamilton looked calm, confident, almost surprisingly settled inside the Ferrari. At first glance, everything looked perfect. But engineers rarely focus on what fans see. They focus on numbers. And one set of numbers started raising eyebrows. Top speed traces. Because when the cars exited corners and accelerated onto the straights, something unusual appeared in the telemetry. Ferrari was fast. Very fast. But not fast enough. The Mercedes-powered cars had a small advantage. Not massive. Not obvious on television. But real. And in Formula One, a small difference repeated lap after lap becomes a strategic nightmare. Suddenly Ferrari engineers understood something uncomfortable. Their car was strong in corners. Strong under traction. Strong in early race phases. But when the race stretched out, and energy deployment became critical, Mercedes still had the edge. And that is exactly the kind of weakness that can destroy a championship campaign. But here is the detail that makes this story far more interesting. Because Ferrari engineers were not surprised by this. In fact, they already had something prepared. Something they had been quietly testing months earlier in Bahrain. Something so radical, they originally planned to introduce it much later in the season. But after Australia, that plan suddenly changed. Inside Maranello, the decision became urgent. Because the next race was China. And China has one of the longest and most punishing straights in Formula One. A straight where every kilometer per hour matters. A straight where overtakes are decided. And Ferrari realized something very dangerous. If Mercedes already had a straight-line advantage in Australia, Shanghai could make that advantage even worse. Unless Ferrari deployed their secret weapon. The rear wing that engineers inside the paddock started calling. The Macarena. But what most fans still do not understand is this. The wing itself is not the real shock. The real shock is what happens when it activates. And when rival teams finally saw how extreme that movement actually was, that is when the panic inside the paddock truly began. At first, many engineers in the paddock thought the nickname was just a joke. The Macarena. It sounded like something invented by journalists. Something exaggerated. Something harmless. But when the first technical images from Bahrain testing started circulating between teams, the laughter stopped. Because Ferrari was not simply adjusting the rear wing. They had redesigned how the entire wing behaves in motion. In a normal Formula One system, the rear wing opens slightly when the drag reduction system activates. A small slot appears. Air flows differently. Drag decreases. Top speed increases a little. It is effective, but limited. Ferrari looked at those limits and asked a different question. What if the wing did not just open? What if it rotated? And that is exactly what they built. Instead of a small movement, the main aerodynamic plane of the wing can rotate dramatically when the car enters straight-line mode. The rotation is enormous. Between roughly 180 degrees and almost 270 degrees. That means the aerodynamic profile almost flips upside down. In corner mode, the wing produces strong downforce. The car stays planted, stable, predictable. But when the driver exits the corner and the straight begins, everything changes. The wing rotates, the airflow reorganizes, and the car suddenly enters something engineers have started calling flight mode. Drag almost disappears. Air resistance drops dramatically, and the car accelerates in a way traditional wings simply cannot match. Early technical estimates suggested the gain could reach 8 to 10 kilometers per hour in ideal conditions. That may not sound huge, but in Formula One, that difference is enormous. It can decide overtakes. It can transform defense. It can turn a car that struggles on straights into a weapon. But here is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Because Ferrari did not rely on a single configuration. According to multiple paddock reports, the team prepared 3 different specifications of this rotating wing for the Chinese Grand Prix. One version designed for higher stability and corner support. Another tuned specifically for the aerodynamic balance required at Shanghai. And a third version, the most extreme one. The full rotation version. The one capable of delivering the maximum straight line advantage. And when rival teams realized Ferrari could switch between these versions depending on conditions, that is when concerns started turning into something else. Because suddenly the question was no longer, can Ferrari make this work? The real question became something far more uncomfortable for the rest of the grid. What happens if they already have? And this is exactly the moment where the story stops being purely technical. Because in Formula One, when a team introduces something radically different, the real battle rarely happens on the track first. It begins in the paddock, behind closed doors, inside engineering briefings. After Australia, several rival teams began studying Ferrari's rotating rear wing concept in detail, frame by frame, sensor by sensor, trying to understand one simple thing: where the limits of the rules actually are. Because the 2026 regulations allow active aerodynamics. That part is legal. Front wings can adapt. Rear wings can change configuration between corner mode and straight line mode. But Ferrari's interpretation pushes that philosophy further than anyone expected. Much further. The moment the wing rotates through such a large angle, the aerodynamic behavior of the car changes dramatically. And that creates a gray area. Not necessarily illegal, but uncomfortable. Some engineers began asking whether such a large rotation might create temporary aerodynamic states that were never intended by the rule makers. Others wondered whether the structure of the wing could flex slightly during activation. Not enough to fail an inspection, but enough to produce additional aerodynamic effects. This is what teams call aeroelastic behavior. And in Formula One history, aeroelasticity has triggered some of the biggest political fights the sport has ever seen. Flexible wings, moving floors, bending front wings. Every era has had its own controversy. So when Ferrari's Macarena wing started circulating in technical discussions, the alarms began ringing. And that is where Mercedes quietly entered the picture. Because Mercedes engineers are among the most experienced in the paddock when it comes to exploiting and challenging regulatory interpretations. They know the process. They know how technical directives emerge. And most importantly, they know when something could threaten their competitive advantage. From Mercedes' perspective, the situation is very clear. If Ferrari truly reduces drag to the level early simulations suggest, then even a powerful Mercedes power unit advantage could start disappearing on long straights. In other words, Ferrari would be fighting engine performance with pure aerodynamics. And that changes the balance of power completely. That is why, according to paddock insiders, discussions between several teams and the FIA intensified after Australia. Not public protests. Not official complaints. But technical questions. Requests for clarification. Carefully worded inquiries about how far active rear wings are allowed to move. And when those conversations start appearing before an upgrade even runs a full race weekend, it usually means one thing. The grid is nervous. Very nervous. Because everyone understands what Shanghai represents. China is not just another race on the calendar. It is the perfect laboratory for this kind of technology. The circuit has long, sweeping corners that demand stability. But it also features one of the longest full throttle sections in Formula One. A straight where aerodynamic efficiency becomes everything. Which means the Chinese Grand Prix could reveal something extremely important. If Ferrari activates the Macarena wing and suddenly starts gaining massive speed at the end of the straight, the entire paddock will notice immediately. And when that happens, the reaction from rival teams could become much louder. But the real reason this story exploded before the Chinese Grand Prix has nothing to do with the wing alone. It has to do with timing. Because Ferrari did not plan to introduce the Macarena system this early in the season. Originally, the concept was scheduled for much later. Some engineers believed it would appear closer to the middle of the championship, when development races usually intensify, when teams start taking bigger risks. But Australia accelerated everything. The moment Ferrari analyzed the Melbourne data, they saw two realities at the same time. The first one was encouraging. The SF-26 was competitive. Very competitive. Strong balance. Good traction. Drivers confident with the car. But the second reality was impossible to ignore. Mercedes still had an advantage in overall efficiency. Not just power. Efficiency. Energy deployment. Drag management. And in the new Formula One era, efficiency decides races. So Ferrari faced a strategic dilemma. Wait several races to introduce their most radical innovation, or deploy it immediately and change the balance of power before rivals can react. Inside Maranello, the decision became urgent, because the next race was not just another circuit. It was Shanghai, a track where aerodynamic drag becomes brutally exposed. The long back straight stretches for more than a kilometer. Drivers spend seconds at full throttle, and every kilometer per hour gained there can translate directly into overtaking opportunities. Ferrari engineers realized something very simple. If their rotating rear wing worked exactly as simulations suggested, China was the perfect battlefield. But introducing something so extreme early in the season also creates another problem. Visibility. The moment Ferrari bolts that wing onto the car, every rival team will analyze it. High-resolution cameras, telemetry comparisons, aeroflow visualization. Nothing stays secret for long in Formula One. And that is precisely why several teams began preparing for this moment before the cars even arrived in Shanghai. Because once Ferrari runs the Macarena wing in a real race, there will be no hiding its performance. If the system delivers the predicted straight-line gains, engineers across the paddock will immediately start calculating the consequences. Championship projections, development budgets, wind tunnel priorities. Some teams may try to copy the concept. Others may push the FIA for clarification. And that brings us back to Mercedes. Because Mercedes understands something that many fans underestimate. The first race of a new regulation era is not where championships are decided. But the second race can reveal something far more important. Direction. Which team has truly understood the rules? Which team has discovered something the others missed? And which team might suddenly become the reference point everyone else must chase? That is why the Chinese Grand Prix became more than just the next round of the calendar. It became the moment when the entire paddock would finally see whether Ferrari's Macarena rear wing is simply an interesting innovation, or the beginning of a technological arms race that could redefine Formula One in 2026. And if the wing performs the way Ferrari hopes, the reaction from rival teams may only be getting started.